First of all, thank you, Michael, for this very inspiring, interesting talk. I would like to talk about higher order writing logic. And before I talk about that, I want to briefly talk about West. In the beginning, in the morning, I told you that West is, in Dutch we call it presentatieinstelling. That's the official term, how it's called. There are 6 presentatieinstellingen in Holland. And sometimes people call them a museum without a collection. And internationally, more people call it the Kunsthal or art center. There is in total 6 presentatieinstellingen in Holland. And here we opened on February this year. Meanwhile, there's a team of around 20 people working. And yeah, those people are like doing the recording today and the bar and everything. And I think what's happening here is also thanks to the great team who work very enthusiastically. And Baruch just mentioned what we try to do is to show the whole spectrum of contemporary art. So this was a project with the architect collective from London called Ensemble. This was a video exhibition with the Candice Brights. There's also like this space which is used for debate, symposia, and education. And there's also publications which try to put the program in a theoretical context. There's guided tours. There's events, debates. We also try to program as wide as possible. So that was an event for undocumented people. And then there's also the library, which is not the library anymore, but the Alphabetum. And so we have mostly 4 or 5 exhibitions running at the same moment. So currently that's the Symptom Bauhaus exhibition, Teaching Shi, Spinoza and the Arts, which is guided by Baruch, and 2 Alphabetum exhibitions. And for all everybody who missed the guided tours in the afternoon, like perhaps there's later on, I think till 6 o'clock you can still look at the exhibitions, and we are open every day. But yeah, today we are here because of these 2 exhibitions, Alphabetum III and IV, and that was also the reason why we organized Alphabetica 2019. And with the Alphabetum, the idea was to create a space which can be used in very different ways, like for events, as a library or as a museum, having dinner together, for music, making film recordings. There will be an interview with Johannes and Ilkar about the exhibition. Unfortunately, we did not manage to have this edited in time, but it will be on the website soon. So when people ask like what the Alphabetum tries to do is that it's an artistic space to explore the formative and the formal aspect of written language. And with that, I mean that whenever we have a letter, there is a form and a meaning. And those are, of course, like interlinked. The form is depending on the meaning, and the meaning is depending on the form. So the letter is a letter because it's a letter, and because it's a letter, it's a letter. And perhaps this sounds like stupid or self-evident, but I believe it can be interesting to look at this aspect from very different perspectives. So the first exhibition at the Alphabetum was focused on literature. It was an exhibition with 3 French writers, artists, Roussel, Brisset, Duchamp. With the second exhibition, we tried to focus on writing. It was called From Typography to Chromatography. And with the third one, I believe that they are about logic. And so there's 2 exhibitions at the moment from the Alphabetum, one in the Alphabetum itself, the other one in the hallway. And so this is Laws of Form and Missing Scripts. And there were lots of people who had a lot of questions, like what's the link between those 2 exhibitions, or what is this exhibition Laws of Form about anyway? So for me, there is a very clear link between the 2, and the link is they address the logic of writing in a very different way. They show two sides of what is possible. So when we start with missing scripts, we had a lot of talks today about that. It's about characters, it's about glyphs, it's about the encoding, and it's about what a letter means. And of course, we all know that there's a lot of different letters from different alphabets, from different scripts, all having a different Unicode, like this, for example. And sometimes you have, you wonder, does this character exist in Unicode? And there's this great website, Shapecatcher, where you can just draw something, and then it will tell you, okay, I have this, those letters exist. So we see, if you draw this angle or this hook, he shows me various different characters which are in the Unicode. And all of them, of course, have a unique Unicode point because they have a different meaning. So when we look at this one, top right corner, Unicode decimal 8,998. And we look at the shape, then of course the shape is also, it's a form, it's a drawing, and the drawing is made with points, and the points, they are based on coordinates. So this form is also a series of numbers. Therefore, the form and the meaning are both numbers. And one number is representing the glyph, the form, and the other one is representing the character. So we have form on the one side and meaning on the other, which are both represented by numbers. And at the end, again, the meaning is depending on the form, and the form is depending on the meaning. That's how letters work. The A is the A because it looks like an A. A letter which looks like a B cannot be an A. So it's, again, this link between the form and the meaning. So if you look at this again, there's some numbers representing the meaning and some numbers representing the form. And they are somehow linked with each other. I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the difference between those two numbers? At the end, they are numbers. So if we put them left and right, and here we have our drawing based on coordinates, based on numbers, and we put those numbers here on the left, and then we say, okay, the meaning, it's this Unicode code point, which is representing, which has a specific meaning. It's this other number here on the right. I'm wondering if this really makes sense to have two sets of numbers. Perhaps we can just have one number in the middle, and this number could define and the form and the meaning. Because then it's much easier. You don't have two sets of numbers, there's just one set of numbers. It seems to be more logical. But the question, of course, is how do you achieve that? Because out of some reasons we have Unicode and it seems to work. So how could we achieve something like that? And this brings me to the other exhibition, to Laws of Form. It's a book which was published exactly 50 years ago. It was written by Georg Spencer Brown, and since then it was never out of print. It was republished, I think 6 times. You see all the editions here, always with a very different cover and from a different publisher, because Georg Spencer Brown was a very specific person. So he always got an argue with a publisher who published his book, so he went to the next publisher who republished his book. And it's a very specific book, and I have to admit that I only know about the book since a very short time. I never heard about it before. And I heard it from an art historian, Beat Wies, and he mentioned the book when I had a conversation with him, and then the person who was with me, he asked him the question, like, if there would be one advice for art students, what would that be? And then he said, like, yeah, they should read Laws of Form. They should read this book. And he said it in such a self-confident way that I said, oh shit, somehow I missed something in life. Like, it must be a very important book. But it's a very specific book, like only very little people know about it. But it became a kind of cult book in the last 50 years. As I mentioned, it never went out of print. And we just organized together with the University of Liverpool a conference. And people from all over the world came to the conference to talk about this book. The conference was organized because of the 50 years of the first publication of the book. Perhaps the most important reason why this book became so famous or so important for some people has to do with the Stuart Brand, who was publishing the Whole Earth Catalog. And Stuart Brand got the book, he read the book, and he said, like, I want to have this book reviewed for my magazine, for the Whole Earth Catalog. So he sent a message to the editors, to the writers, with a question like, could you please write a review for this book? And then he got this reply, people telling like, Jesus Christ, I'm not ready to review it. And perhaps the most important is the last sentence, the book is too simple to grasp. So in that way, what's the difficulty with the book? So he sent another letter to Heinz von Förster, and he tells him, like, could you please review the book, because together with all the writers we talked about it, and if there's one person who can review the book, it seems to be you. And Heinz von Förster read the book and he replied like, yes, I will review it. So after reading the book, Heinz von Förster concluded that the book is about second-order cybernetics. And second-order cybernetics is like also called as the cybernetics of cybernetics. And everybody who does not know about like cybernetics, basically it means it's about understanding. So it's about trying to understand what it means to understand something. And this holy moment happens in the 11th chapter. Everybody like who read the book agrees like the first 10 chapters are just made for the 11th chapter because there the whole magic happens. And it also seems that Georg Spencer Brown started with the 11th chapter, but it was so complex, so he had to write the other 10th chapter to explain how he got to the 11th chapter. So when I read the book, it's a very complex book, it's very hard to understand. For me, the most striking was that Georg Spencer Brown introduces in this book calculus, like a kind of logical model, which he says it's based on a single sign. And this is the sign, what we see here, which he calls the mark of distinction. And if you think about it, like how can you communicate or how can you build a logic with one sign? Like it seems to be impossible. So the sign, the mark of distinction, he introduces to define the distinction. So what he says in the beginning of the book is distinction is perfect continence, and this means that a distinction is made by separating one area completely from another area. And that's what's happening here with a circle. Like if you have the circle, you can talk about like a marked or an unmarked space, and this is a distinction. And it's important that the circle has to be closed. So if you look at this circle, I believe that it's exactly the same what we do as a type designer. It's a shape. And there is this famous quote, "A letter is two shapes, one light, one black." And some people may know it's from this book, also the first chapter from Gerrit Notzoy. I believe that both are at the end saying a very similar thing. So coming back to the laws of form, the first striking thing at the book is that it starts with some Chinese, which is not annotated. We just have to take it for what it is. And we go to the next page, and there we see he is introducing this mark of distinction. And it's interesting how he describes this sign, or you could also say letter. The interesting thing is that within this description, you can again see this self-reference, which is like a distinction, distinguished, and a mark being marked. But from what I know is that all those sentences are formulated very carefully. And if we go to the next page, he shows us his two basic axioms on what he's using to build up his calculus. That's the first axiom. He's using this mark, and basically what he's telling here is that this mark could be, or has to be understood as a description of the circle. So he said, like, this can be understood like, look, there's a circle, there's a distinction. And what he says, like, if you say, like, there's a circle, and you say again, there's a circle, it's still one circle. So that's the first law. If you repeat it, it's not double, it's a single. So he also calls this the law of condensation, or the law of calling. And the second law is what he calls the law of crossing. And there he says, if you have a circle and you're outside the circle, you can also identify the circle by crossing the border. And crossing the border twice will bring you at the same spot where you started. So therefore, this is the the law of crossing, or how he calls it, the law of cancellation, which means like crossing and again crossing results into nothing. So what I find interesting is, what is this thing like? And if we accept that Georg Spencer Brown created a language, then this is a letter it's a letter of the Georg Spencer Brown language, and this letter he calls the mark of distinction. And if you think, like, what is a mark of distinction, then I think that is what a letter is. Because the A is distinguished from the B, because it's not the one is the A and the other is the B. So in that way, I believe that you can understand this, what we see here, as the letter. So not letter A, not letter B, but the letter. And what he does then is he uses this letter, and we can do very simple things. There's two decisions we can do. We have to start with something. And the next one can be either put next to it, the next letter, or the first one gets nested. And this decision you have to make every time you put the next letter, which is always the same letter. So the next you can put either like this or like this, and it goes on like this. So if you look at that, you have to ask yourself, like, how do we actually write? Is there something or do all those languages which are used at the moment, do they have something in common? And I believe yes, they have something in common. All writing systems are, at the end, sequential. And with sequential, I mean that once you put the A and you put the next letter, the A does not change. There's like a sequence of meanings which have like individual meanings. They are not totally interlinked. And I also believe that this sequential writing even applies to math. Like, of course, it matters like where you put the 2, like when you see like x power 2, of course it matters if the 2 is on top of the x or next to the x, but the x is not changing to another letter depending on where the next letter is positioned. So even like mathematical writing, which is like planar writing, like in two-dimensional space, it's still sequential writing. Whereby the square root, I think it's a very interesting sign, because there you can actually see that it is interlinked. This is a different meaning than this. And of course, we know that this is a problem at the moment, currently also with Unicode-based writing systems, that, how do we deal with that? We don't know Unicode is not based on the idea that letters should be variable, that they should be dynamic. So people, when they work with LaTeX, they run into this problem. Like, how do we get this square root look like we want to have it? And once you look further, there's lots of people complaining about the ugly square root, and nobody managed to deal with this challenge. And the challenge is perhaps not solvable because Unicode is based on sequential writing. It's not based on the idea that something is like totally nested. So if you look at those two exhibitions, what we currently have at the Alphabetum, missing scripts and laws of form, like missing scripts is showing a very important thing. It is showing like that communication is important and we have to facilitate it. But it is also showing how sequential writing logic is functioning. And perhaps laws of form is showing something different. So if you look at this again, the first question, which also I think other people mentioned before with other talks, is like, but how do you type that? What's the interface for such a writing? And we don't need that anymore. We can make it smaller, or at the end, that's enough. So we made a little website in combination with the exhibition called Writing the Mark. And with this website, we want to explore like what's really going on with this mark of distinction, with this letter. What's really happening there? So when we want to write how Georg Spencer Brown is writing in laws of form, we have to have something which is flexible, something which is like flexible on the height, on the width, and so on, where we can put one sign into another one, into another one, into another one, into another one, endlessly. We cannot work with static shapes, but we have to work with one shape which is dynamic. So the website does three things. The first is it shows like how this variable letter works. So it's based on a variable font. So that's like an open type font. And we have like some parameters with which we can modify how this sign looks like. Another thing on the website is a kind of random generator, which is just taking this letter and puts it inside each other, like nested. It's like, basically it works like it's always like either if you compare it with boxes, you have the first box and the second box is either put next to the first box or put the first box put into the second box. The third thing and most important thing is the website also shows a way how we can translate our sequential writing into the nested writing. So that's a very simple application. You use brackets or parentheses, and with that you make your logic, and this then gets directly converted into a text string based on the variable font. So it's important that we realize what we see here. This is text. It's just text. Google can read it. Google can also understand it. Let's take this like simple form. And let's look at this from the Unicode perspective, like from a sequential writing logic. With a sequential writing logic, we would need 3 letters, because the second have a different shape, so this has to be a different letter. So we have A, B, and the third one is the same again, so this would look like that. Let's look at those 3 letters, and then we learned like there's a form and there's a meaning, and then the form is based on coordinates, and the last one and the first one are the same, so those coordinates are the same. They also have a meaning, and the one in the middle has a different form, also has a different meaning. This is how it works currently with the Unicode. Once we use a variable font, like a font which is flexible, which is dynamic, which is, you could also say, causal, then we have 3 times the same shape, because the second shape is just based on, all the 3 shapes are based on the same form. We just changed them. And if we look then at the form and meaning, we have 3 times the same form and 3 times the same meaning, which sounds strange, because so there is no meaning at all, because everything is the same. But that's not really the case. If you look at this example once more, there are those 3 parameters, or you could say axes, or dimensions. And with those 3 dimensions, we create the logic. So if we look again at the form and meaning, because the form is identical, we can just skip it. And because the meaning is identical, we can also just skip it. And what you actually get is nothing. But again, we have to take those 3 parameters and add them. And so we see that the first one is just like you could say a default state. The second one is a state which is a little bit higher, a little bit wider. And the third one is again the default state. And now we have like one set of numbers. And this set of numbers could be understood as like a coordinate in a 3-dimensional space, or as like values for axes. And if you look again at the source code, what's happening here, you see that this is really text, and the modifications of those 3 characters are also within the source code. You can trace it, you can read it, you can see it. It's a value. It's like 3 parameters. It's the 3 parameters with which we define the variable font. So in that way, the 3 axes, they represent actual axes within a variable font, like I used width, top, and left. And this generates a very simple writing logic. And if you compare that with the sequential writing logic, it's much more simple. So in that way, I believe we have to work hard on get more languages encoded, and we have to work hard to make Unicode better. And at the same time, we also have to consider that there's something beyond Unicode, that we could also imagine a writing system without form, without meaning, but just with dependencies or relation. And that's totally different from the writing logic what we have currently, and that's what I understand as a higher order writing logic.